So, listen, tonight we're going to talk about hypothermia. The human body has reasonable thermoregulatory mechanisms to preserve core temperature at optimal levels. But in cold conditions, especially with high wind chill or high humidity, or if there is exhaustion or injury, then heat loss exceeds heat generation and hypothermia ensues as the body's physiology and metabolism fails. So the definition is that hypothermia is a condition where the body's temperature drops below its normal 37 degrees, clinically defined as core temperature less than 35. Okay, so some O-level physics, as it were. How does the body lose heat? What are the main mechanisms? And how do we prevent those? Now, in dry, still environments, radiation is perhaps your main mechanism of heat loss. But in the mountain environment, the wet, windy mountain environment, convection and evaporation are more important. Okay. So, of course, it's a question of heat balance. And as well as heat loss, we have some capacity for heat generation. Two main mechanisms: fuel, food and breakdown of calories generates thermogenic activity, and similarly, muscle activity, either involuntary by shivering or by active exercise, increases your metabolic rate. They say that shivering increases metabolic heat production by a factor of 3 to 5 times, whereas food and exercise can increase heat production by a factor of 10 to 15 times. In the mountain environment, we should consider maybe two forms of hypothermia. Sudden immersion hypothermia, from our point of view, might occur with falling into water in a crevasse or even in an avalanche incident. But more commonly, we might be addressing exposure hypothermia, exhaustion hypothermia, more gradual onset. So exhaustion and hypothermia are closely linked as the body runs out of fuel. Other factors promoting hypothermia in the mountain environment: wind chill, obviously. The very old and very young are more susceptible. Trauma or enforced immobility is a major factor determining hypothermia. And of course, hypothermia makes your trauma outcomes worse. Your individual cooling rates depend on a number of factors: cold acclimatization, body size, age, insulation, both clothing and subcutaneous fat, your ability to shiver, your body movement, and the amount of the body surrounded by the cold medium. What happens when our bodies get cold? Well, this is a sort of busy slide, but basically, as your core temperature drops, the body attempts to conserve heat by reducing blood flow to the peripheries by vasoconstriction, and it attempts to generate heat by shivering, by burning fuel. As these strategies fail and your temperature drops even lower, shall we say below 32, between 32 and 30, your shivering stops and your body metabolism progressively fails. Now, it's a multi-system, really, but we should focus in and concentrate on two systems: the central nervous system, the brain, and the neurology, because as you become progressively colder, there's increasing clumsiness and loss of manual dexterity and muscle strength. And people speak of the umbles, the stumbles, mumbles, grumbles, fumbles. So the progressive loss of cognitive function. So a progressive decline, impaired judgment and decision-making, progressive confusion, sometimes inappropriate behaviors like paradoxical undressing, but eventually deeper unconsciousness unrousable coma and eventual death. The other system just to remember is the vascular system. We've spoken about vasoconstriction, but as the core temperature drops, the heart muscle becomes progressively more irritable, and there's increasing risk of irregular and potentially fatal heart rhythms. Now, rough handling, that's large movements of the limbs, flexing the limbs, flexing your hip, can force cold blood back from the periphery and can trigger fatal arrhythmias. You know, when you've got significant hypothermia with a core temperature less than 32. So that's cheery. How do we diagnose hypothermia? Well, basically situational awareness and a high index of suspicion. I think someone said that in the UK environment, you know, with an ambient air temperature less than 28 degrees Celsius, you will get hypothermic in the hills if you wait long enough. So a simple twist, a simple injury, twisted ankle, you know, can lead to hypothermia. In the stress of a sort of a casualty, it's always important to have a mnemonic, an easy way of remembering, and the first aid ABCDs are always important. In this case, we might actually discuss them in reverse order, because that's kind of the order how things will unfold on the hill with exhaustion hypothermia, okay? So first of all, G, glucose. Don't ever forget glucose. Glucose, low glucose due to exhaustion. F, fractures, trauma. Trauma causes hypothermia. Hypothermia makes your trauma worse. E, exposure. Are they shivering or not? D, disability. And by that I mean conscious level. And people use the mnemonic ACVPU. Is the person alert? Are they confused? Are they responsive just to voice? Are they responsive just to pain? Are they deeply unconscious? C, circulation, rough handling can trigger cardiac arrest, as we've said. B, breathing, that's when you're checking for signs of life. It's an untrained, a non-healthcare professional possibly shouldn't bother checking for a carotid pulse. Your signs of life is whether they're breathing or not. And A is keeping the airway open. So, just to introduce stages of hypothermia, the concept of cold stress. I think this is more familiar in the American descriptions, but obviously, you know, somebody standing in their t-shirt outside their front door is and shivering is not really hypothermic if they've just been out there for half an hour. They're probably just cold stressed. So cold stress is that sort of pre-hypothermia range where you're heading towards hypothermia, but your core temperature is greater than 35. Traditionally, hypothermias can be classified mild, moderate, severe based on your core temperature. But of course, measurement of core temperature on the hill is inaccurate and impractical and in the field. So the Swiss came up with a staging system for hypothermia, which doesn't rely on core temperature, and it's determined by the presence or absence of shivering, by the consciousness level, and by whether they have, you know, vital signs of life. So these are the 4 Swiss stages of hypothermia. But for the recreational mountaineer, it comes down to 2 stages. Either they're mild or there's everything else. Mild hypothermia is reversible in the wild, and it responds to shelter, insulation, fuel, and the casualty is able to exercise and perhaps hopefully self-rescue. But everything else, you really are looking at an organized rescue, because the victim is incapacitated and needs active rewarming and hospital interventions, as the mountain rescue teams will know.
When you say core temperature, Declan, is that the same as the temperature that would read if you had a thermometer in your mouth, or is it a kind of deeper temperature than that?
Well, yes, the temperature in normal circumstances, measuring your temperature in the mouth or with one of these ear tympanic membrane thermometers will give an accurate reflection of your core. But in progressive hypothermia, your periphery will shut down. So a mouth thermometer will not read accurately. The little tympanic membrane thermometers you put in the ear, well, your ear canal may be cold, it may be full of fluid or snow. So measurement of core temperature in hypothermia is very difficult. It requires special epitympanic thermistors, or an esophageal measurement, which only really happens when you're intubated. So the hospital organized rescue teams do fret a lot over core temperature and its measurement, but in the mountain environment, it's very difficult and it's almost not worth going there. The simple measures you might have just won't read accurately. So you go on the Swiss staging system. So listen, that was all the boring didactic stuff, just as a refresher. But I wanted us to go ski touring. And we're on day 7 of a winter room Haute Route. It's sort of early February. We've had a really good week so far. You've been a really strong, fit team. You're all exceptionally fit, and there's not a pick of fat on you. You're all lean as a whippet. But we've had good conditions. And here we are at the Vignette Hut. We're heading out the Vignette Hut on the last day of the Haute Route to Zermatt. Just managed to pick up a French or Swiss weather forecast. So for 3,000 meters, it's -10 Celsius, wind from the northeast, 10 to 12 meters per second, intermittent showers. And as you know, here we are from the Vignette. We've got sort of the 3 calls and 10 hours to get to Zermatt. So it's quite a big day. Okay. So what was that wind speed again? Meters per second, 10 to 12 meters per second. How does that translate? What do we think of that?
It's about 20 to 25 knots.
Yeah, knots. So I think in miles per hour.
Well, that's a bit more then. Yeah,
well, so I really struggle sometimes interpreting forecasts. So having a little aid memoir like this does help. So yeah, so it's a really sort of stiff breeze, 25, 30 miles per hour, 40 to 49 K. And at -10, that gives us a significant wind chill, doesn't it? So it's, what shall we say, -20. Okay. So how are we going to avoid hypothermia? This is us outside the hut. How are we going to avoid hypothermia today?
Either don't go, stay in the hut, or I suppose you'd have to come up with a plan B if you did decide to commit.
Okay.
Lots of food en route in the group shelter, and hope you can keep the pace up.
Yeah. Okay. So group shelter, preparation, food and fuel, and you're beginning to mutiny already. Is that you, Neil?
No.
Okay, so whether we go or not, any other thoughts?
I think go at a pace that can be maintained, so you don't end up with some people stopping still and waiting for a long time.
Very good. Yes, indeed. Pacing, not setting too fast a pace, avoiding sweating, keeping the group together. Yeah, for sure.
I think there are some human factors things, Declan, about like agreeing that it might be an issue and setting some review points. Perhaps that the coals provide a prime location for that.
Yes, Dan, that's a good point. How
set is the weather forecast, Declan? Is it pretty consistent? There's nothing sort of waiting in the wings that might come in a bit earlier during the afternoon when you're getting a bit tired and things like that.
To be honest, Richard, I only just picked up those bare bones. You know, it says showers.
Is there a bed and breakfast en route?
I was gonna add, brief the team to watch for some signs like frost nip on the nose, little early warning signs.
Yes, that's a very good point. That's a good point. People often speak of having a buddy system, watching for frost nip and frostbite. Yeah, the wind chill is -20 for sure.
You could have a turnaround point, couldn't you? Really, you could, if you did decide to go, you could risk, with all these provisos, going to the first coal with a sort of decision, literally 50-50. You make your mind, you're half committed to coming back to the hut where you started.
Yeah.
Before you finally commit, because you got 3 coals, haven't you, to say the least.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, you got a point. There's a point in between with the Bukatan, isn't there? Which is a very nice place to stay. But
the things, there's actually another wee hut over on the Italian side called the Tuoni or something like that. It's cold, but it's before the.
Yeah, then I know the one you mean, the Nakamuli, I think as well. Yeah. Okay.
As far as getting people, for people to prepare by having their face shield in their jacket, not the bottom of the rucksack, having their goggles, having, if they're wearing the helmet, make sure they've got some covering underneath where it's a buff. So that they've basically, I've done this in Scotland, so that people have got their gear together before it gets bad.
Yes. Yeah, no, anticipating and being prepared with your gear.
Yeah, there was I heard an interview with the people in the British Antarctic Survey a while ago, and the biggest thing they did to protect against the cold was layering, making sure they didn't sweat.
Yep.
And wearing lots of thin layers so they could, you know, strip off or layer up to just make sure that they didn't perspire, because that was the biggest thing that caused a chill.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good brainstorm. I think you've more or less sort of listed nearly everything I had sort of thought about there. Somebody also, when I did this before, suggested a strategy where you kind of lead from the back and you put your slowest out front to try and keep the party together. But yes, effective group leadership is key here, and prevention. Continually reassess objectives and be prepared to turn back. And I think it was Neil. Was it Neil? It was you who said maybe should we go down or look for a bed and breakfast? Well, there was a guided party in the winter room, and they seem to have gone down this morning. I'm not sure why.
Presumably, self-diagnosis of hypothermia is a pretty rare thing, is it?
Yes, I think that is kind of true. You need to be self-aware, of course, but as you get progressively colder, I mean, you'll come through the shivering phase. That should be that should warn you. But after that, below 34 degrees Celsius, you're getting a little bit. Your brain's not functioning very well. You're not making smart judgments. You know, you're possibly likely just to put your head down and try and soldier on. And yeah, so after a certain point, your judgment is going to fail. So it's not, self-diagnosis isn't going to see you through.
It's quite hard to spot sort of frost nip on the nose and stuff. I've had it before and didn't realize it, and somebody pointed it out to me.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was totally oblivious.
Yeah. Closest
I've been has been, apart from the obvious superficial symptoms, loss. I actually couldn't move my arms at one point. And literally, you know, the way you sort of plod along, slowly cooling without really realizing. And many years ago, we were out in some similar conditions, fairly unpleasant. And I literally couldn't put my jacket on or off. My pal had to do it for me.
Okay, so listen, we've pressed on, and we've been going for a couple of hours. We're slogging up towards the col de Mont Brûlé, and you notice that John is lagging behind. He's a very fit normally, but he's quite thin. When you stop and let him catch up, you can see that he's shivering uncontrollably, but he's conscious and breathing. What are we going to do, guys?
Feed him.
Sorry?
As my name is John, I'll say it. So get the group shelter out and get some food, maybe a hot drink.
Yeah.
Check he's got enough clothes on.
Okay, very good. Okay, so yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah, he's shivering, conscious and breathing, hypothermia stage 1. But yes, group shelter. I mean, I don't need to, you know, tell anybody about the benefits of group shelter, and also the significant amount of heat you can generate when, you know, there's enough people in there. So group shelter, and then we were saying about insulation, layers, and putting layers on.
One more would be find out if he's frightened about anything.
Right. You mean in terms of what, a sense of impending doom?
Yes, I've heard of a case in Antarctica where a couple of people in very good conditions became afraid of falling through the sea ice and completely incapacitated because the fear had brought it on.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't know. This John is is shivering uncontrollably. Maybe for maybe more than.
It's John here. If I can just say, would it be good to get a couple of people sat right close next to him to try and get, you know, in the group shelter, try and get some, because just putting layers on it's not going to warm him up as such. It's going to prevent loss, but maybe a couple of people next to him to try and warm him up.
Yes, I mean, I think crowding into the group shelter, getting as many people in there as possible, each sort of, you know, kilowatt bulb that people are generating, insulating from the ground, sit him down on the rucksack, put on more layers, especially, you know, extra gloves and on the head.
If he's in that condition, then the rest of the group, presumably, the thinner ones particularly, won't be far behind, you would think.
That's a really good point, Neil. If one person suffering from hypothermia, think of the rest of the group. That's a really good point. What about this question? You see it in all the first aid books. Replace dry for wet clothing. What does the group think of that?
I think you're probably better just putting more on, because you start taking stuff off, it's just going to get colder.
I suppose if it's absolutely soaked through, wringing wet, you fed into a pond, that might be different.
Yeah, that's different.
That's
yeah.
Doesn't it depend what your base layer is made of? Because if it's going to be fast wicking, it's fine to leave it on. But if it's cotton, then you've got a real problem, haven't you?
Yeah, I think you've got to be careful of physics there, haven't you? Because I think the thing that drives moisture is heat, usually. So what you're trying to do is reduce. I think Peter's right. If you can put on an outer layer which isn't going to evaporate, then essentially you're putting them in a wetsuit, which if he or she is generating heat, they're not going to lose it. But if being wet is causing them to lose heat, and you haven't got any alternative, I would have thought you'd be better off taking it off. Yeah,
I think, I mean, the mountain rescue team sort of advice is that it's safer to leave wet clothes on and add dry layers on top and a vapor barrier. and that you'd only really sort of seek to sort of replace wet layers, or, you know, undress somebody to replace wet layers if you're in a, you know, a sheltered environment with significant levels of warmth, because there's a risk of, you know, of pushing the core temperature down further by undressing. So I think the current advice is not to replace dry for wet unless you can do it in a sheltered environment, etc.
Yes, that observation about the vapor barrier, I think, is key. You know, talking to, you know, referencing what Dan's talking about, the heat and the vaporization and latent heat losses consuming energy and lowering core temperature and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
I don't write these tangential examples, but I'm going to make one anyway. I know with the Antarctic and Arctic sort of cutting edge expeditions now, they're actually using vapor barrier sleeping bags on the inside to stop their body sweat and their moisture that they're generating, getting their sleeping bags
down, yes,
wet, to make sure they're as efficient as possible. I mean, of course, they're going wrinkly through the night, but it's and it's not quite the same as the old stiff as a board reindeer sleeping bags of the turn of the century, but yeah.
No, you're right. Vapor barriers are kind of key here, and we'll come back to it just a little bit later when we looking at sort of packaging. So we've sheltered, we've insulated fuel and fluids. So it's probably exhaustion or hypothermia here. We've been going 4 hours and replacing the calorie deficit. So initial glucose for fast absorption. I think an isotonic sports gel should be part of every first aid kit. Then you want to put in complex carbs, and remember that the initial glucose won't last long, so plan to stop and refuel every 15 to 20 minutes. What about hot or cold drinks? We've got here hot unsweetened black tea or cold energy drink. Which is better?
Are we talking morale or physics?
We're talking physics, Dan. With you, definitely we're talking physics. What else?
Both.
A sweet and cold drink's going to be better in the long run, isn't it?
Yeah. So basically, are there any thermal benefits from hot drinks? No, it doesn't really raise your core temperature. But as you've said, it can be a morale boost. So yes, it's still, you know, part of everybody's first aid, hot sweet tea, but it's the calories and the fluid that are the most important factors. What about this fancy whiskey? That should be good, shouldn't it?
If it's your finger ends.
Opposite effect, it does the wrong thing.
It's high calorie.
Expands your capillaries.
Expands your capillaries.
That's right.
Kill them off.
So it's not a good idea. It vasodilates, it accelerates your heat loss. It also aids return of cold peripheral blood to your core. It acts as a diuretic. No, you save that for afterwards. Okay. What about exercise? Because at this stage, you know, they may be able to generate heat by exercising. So I think initially you'd want them to rest, to sit down on the rucksack, to rest, to refuel, to replace their calorie. But thereafter, if they're mild hypothermia stage 1, you would allow them to exercise progressively. And this may be crucial in self-rescue. You're likely that you may have to ski or walk off the mountain.
So obviously, in terms of movement and generating heat, everyone's familiar with the concept that you get hot if you do physical work. Obviously, one of the reasons that mammals are one of the most broadly spread animal types is because we have the ability through muscles to generate heat. But how much? I mean, obviously, shivering is a muscle activation to try and generate heat.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you're not shivering and you're just passive, how much heat are your muscles generating? A lot. If you're sat there resting, admittedly you got company and you're in a shelter. Are you generating much heat or not?
Not much by that. I mean, I think I've seen a quote saying that shivering can raise your metabolic rate 3 to 5 times, but active exercise, and that might be doing press-ups in the shelter, as it were, can increase that to sort of a factor of 10. So active voluntary exercise is more thermogenic than shivering, but you need a lot of calories for it.
What about just sat there doing nothing, just resting?
I would say shivering is probably better than that, because you're shivering to try and generate more than you would passively resting.
So yeah, but with the sort of diverting body energy to consume fuels and the like, your rest period is literally that, a rest period to recharge.
I think
it's the combustion system.
I think the mountain rescue teams recommend 30 minutes just so that you can get some benefit from the calories, that there's no point exercising if you're calorie deficient. We've sort of covered all of that, and as Neil said, if one person in the group is suffering from hypothermia, check everybody else. So here we are. Where were we? What's our plan? Speaking of group management, what's our plan?
I think you've got to see how he recovers, haven't you?
Yeah.
How he responds to these various treatments that you're doing.
He has recovered after 30 minutes. Fuel, fluid, and insulation. He's done some star jumps. He's stopped shivering. He says he's all right.
I should continue if possible and take a review at the call.
The call, yes, I would review at the call, because you can always go back to the Bukatan.
Yeah, that's right. We could always go back to the Bukatan. We could go down to Arolla. But okay, I'm glad you're with me. We're going on. Okay.
Sorry, Neil.
Declan, is the weather behaving itself by this point? Is it keeping to forecast or?
No. As soon as we got to the call, it got a bit murky.
Yeah.
And we've pressed on for further hour. We've got delayed at the call, a bit technical. So we've pushed on, and a further hour. Here we are past Col de Mont Brûlé. John is no longer shivering. He's conscious, but he's incoherent. He's poorly coordinated, unsteady on his skis. He is breathing. What are we going to do?
Advance warning to the mountain rescue that they might be needed.
Okay, he's not shivering, conscious, impaired conscious breathing, hypothermia stage 2. Yeah, what are we going to do?
His core temperature is still dropping, isn't it? So at the end of the day, he's not improving. Now, either you've not, as a group, maybe they've not been feeding, or they've not been, or it's just, he's had a bit of sugar. I guess he's improved temporarily, but he carried on his downward spiral, hasn't he?
So he's carried on, and yes, we forgot to stop for fueling, actually. Remember what, there's mild hypothermia and there's everything else. And he sort of has passed beyond the ability to turn it around with fuel and food and insulation. But we will, I'm sure we'll try that again. We'll get out the group shelter again.
Well, we've got to get him out of there, haven't we, somehow, and he's not going to make it on his own, basically.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like sounds like the day is now it's not about completing the route at all. It's about getting him to a safe place, and that becomes the, I don't know, you know, the objective of the day is extracting him safely.
And the rest of the group as well, because
Yes. Yeah. So
he's in stage 1. We recovered him. We recovered him to stage 0.
Yeah.
And then we've ignored him getting into stage 1 again.
Yeah.
And he's jumped into stage 2. It's just a training exercise.
Yeah. No, exactly, Harvey. Yeah.
how fast will somebody deteriorate from stage, to stage 1 to 2? I mean, I suppose that's a very arbitrary, not very precise question, but I mean,
It'll be quite quick.
Yeah.
I think it can be quite quick. And as I say, as you've pointed out, if we've not refueled, if he's not mindful of his condition, and he's getting a little bit dulled mentally, he may not say, if we're not keeping a watch and we're too busy sort of battling the elements, then yes, easily in an hour we could slip and deteriorate.
I suppose we should have allocated somebody as a buddy to pester him to death and make sure he was, to look after him closely. We obviously missed that opportunity.
Yeah, no, as a leader, I probably should have been right behind him all the way. But he's now.
Do you have any sort of signal
there? John, no, we don't. No mobile reception.
So that's perhaps one of the things we should have thought of before we went over the call, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, no, and yeah, no, I have one of these new Garmin InReaches, but I didn't bring it on this trip.
Send some text. You might as well send a text. There's nothing lost.
Where's the way, isn't it?
Okay, so
have you got your What 3 Words app though?
No. So listen, we want to try and refuel, but there is an issue here. If he's becoming progressively, if his conscious level is dropping, as his temperature drops below 32, he may lose his gag reflex. He may not be able to swallow. And so it would be great to get more fuel and fluids into him, but we do have to make an assessment of that. Can he swallow safely? Okay. And the very fact that he's progressed deeper in hypothermia and is no longer shivering suggests that he's now at risk of cardiac irritability, and we need to be very careful with rough handling. So basically he can't exercise, and that means he needs to be kept horizontal. He needs to be evacuated smoothly with minimal movement. He essentially needs an organized rescue. Now, if the if rescue was just 20 minutes away or 30 minutes away, we might take a chance and sort of brace him up between two people and try and get there. But yeah, no, we're in trouble here. Okay.
Well, I guess our key decision, Declan, is it sensible to risk the lives of other people to go and organise a rescue, given that you've got no communications? I think essentially is what you've just said.
Yeah.
And first rule of first aid is not to put anybody else in peril, isn't it? So it's a big decision.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, how much clothing has he got on at this stage?
He basically has all his layers. He's got his Gore-Tex on, and he's put his belay duvet jacket over the top. He's got everything on he has.
You better get in a bit careful.
Thing that anybody else would have.
Yeah. Well, if we're saying what is the most effective bit of kit you could carry in your rucksack as a portable weather barrier in this situation? We've got a plastic survival bag. We've got a single foil sheet We've got a foil bivy bag, the Sol bivy bag. We've got a
Is it the Blizzard? I
Blizzard.
think I got one, the Blizzard bag that would actually give a lot more insulation.
yeah, yeah, exactly that. These are some of the various sort of properties of them, but yes, in essence, it's your Blizzard bag is your most effective layer. In effect, it's a reflective multi-layer metallized plastic sheet with some air cells in between. So it acts as a vapor barrier, which is very effective for the wet casualty. It blocks radiant heat. It has some insulating properties and blocks evaporation and convection. So pound for pound, that's probably your best option to have. We're going to have to try and rescue him horizontally. Maybe we should try and improvise a hypothermia insulation package.
Declan, just before you do that, there's been a request if we could just see that insulation comparison table.
Yeah, it doesn't give the actual effective insulations, just their yeah.
Now, having made several cock-ups, so the whole team's in this mess, you know, which is really what's gone wrong. We should have nipped this in the bud a lot earlier in the day, shouldn't we, really? But having done that, you know, I don't know what you're more or less forced, presumably, to stay put and try and get, because the whole team's not going to be too far behind. Granted, there might be a few people who can get back to the hut to raise the alarm, but
yeah,
you know, I don't know. It's somebody's got to stay with this guy, and several people within a group shelter with that on and everything on him, I guess.
We could try and do a hypothermia package. Just, you know, I mean, you may be familiar with these. If we have a rope, we can lay it out in coils, poles. If we had a spare group shelter, I wouldn't offer up my group shelter, but if you have your largest waterproof material, you lay your insulating mat, like a foam mat, or on top, and then you put your casualty inside your Blizzard bag, ideally, if you have it. You may add warmth. We'll come back to that later, but inside the Blizzard bag, or if you had a sleeping bag, very important to to look after the head and put on a hat. And then you would wrap them up in that, wrap the tarp or the plastic sheet around them. So in that way, they're protected from evaporative and convective heat loss from the outer tarp and the Blizzard bag, conductive heat loss through the sleeping mat, radiant heat through the foil layers of the Blizzard bag. A mountain rescue member said to me that what they do is they put somebody into a Blizzard bag, they tuck it in tightly around them, they seal it at the neck with a buff, and then they put on a hat, and then they put them into a CAS bag, which is an outer waterproof layer, or indeed a vacuum mattress. But that's effectively what their hypothermia package is, sort of on the hill. I don't know if...
Generally, you know, if we have a casualty on the hill that's immobile, it's because they're injured.
Yeah.
And of course, they're sat there and they're getting cold. And just as part of the package, generally, we play cautious. So we suspect spinal injury. So we do the full package. You know, it's the vac mat inside the CAS bag, which is basically just a big fleece sleeping bag, onto a stretcher. And then, you know, if they can, it's helicopter evacuation out. If not, then we carry them, you know, down to a location where they can be helicoptered out, or back down the road to await an ambulance.
Yeah.
Problem is, we've only got 6 of us, haven't we?
Yeah. Where we, and of course, you know, we're generally mob-handed, where you might say have their companions who are not injured, but they've obviously been stationary. A good example actually would be, we had a rescue on the Buchel on Hogmanay. I think we called out about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just as it was getting dark. And these lads, they're up at about 850 meters. One of them had fallen, was injured. Luckily, he was what we'd call walking wounded. So by the time we got there, they'd probably just been there in cold, getting dark, getting scared. Bit of a precarious situation. But really, it's kind of a case of tough love. We just got them moving.
Yeah.
And frog marched them off.
Yeah.
You know, shovel some Kit Kats down the neck and marched them off.
And how cold do you reckon they were?
Well, I wasn't the first to get to the casualties. You know, someone else got to the one who was supposedly injured, but it was just a mild lower leg injury. You know, we walked him off, and then there was his companion. You know, they were probably shivering, but you know, they responded to the get a rope on them, get them moving, get them off the hill. If they'd been the other category, then obviously would have had to evacuate them manually.
Yeah.
But it's kind of surprising how long people can hang about, you know, before they get really cold. But it was, you know, it was dry conditions. All right, it was cold, but it was dry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This scenario, we've got quite high winds, haven't we? So
yeah, I mean, if somebody was stuck out on the hill right now, they'd get very cold very quickly. It's very wet, very windy.
Okay, so where were we? Yeah, here we are.
One more question. Is there enough snow for the snow hole?
Ah, yes. Good man. So here we are. We've done a hypothermia package. What are we going to do? There's a big snowbank wind scoop 50 meters away. So yeah, let's snow hole. Or if there wasn't enough snow, maybe we should think of a shovel up. Yeah, emergency shelter. Maybe we could send somebody for help. The huts are, you know, in difficult terrain away. It's early February. They're likely to be unguardianed. We've got no phone reception. Yeah, so it looks like we're snowholing. By the time we've done a snowhole, and by the time John is inside, he's no longer, he's not shivering, he's no longer conscious, but he's still breathing. But we've dug out a really good big snow hole, and we're all safely in there for the duration. Anything else we might try and do at this stage? Harvey?
So we're already in stage 2, and we've already assessed that stage 2 needs external assistance.
Yep.
So from the moment he went into stage 2, we need to come up with a rescue plan because we're not capable of doing it ourselves.
Yeah,
so
no, maybe.
All this shelter stuff is protection until the cavalry arrive.
Yeah, indeed, precisely that. And depending on the time of day and depending on the status of the rest of the party, you know, I think there's some difficult decisions. Do we go for help? Have we left? Are we expected in Zermatt? Will anybody come looking for us? Yeah, all of these questions, which I hadn't really bothered to plan on this tour, I'm afraid.
Well, you've got to raise the alarm, and you've got to raise it as soon as possible.
Yeah, but we're 4 o'clock in the evening at this stage.
Declan, how many are in the group?
There's 6 of us.
We all get in the same group shelter inside the snow hole.
Exactly. So, but at this stage, John's no longer conscious. He's technically now stage 3.
You're gonna have to check for his airway, isn't he? He's going into that stage that you don't want him lying on his back and whatever, because he could choke.
Exactly. You want to place him in the recovery position. Though you have to be careful. Your traditional way of placing somebody in the recovery position, you know, draw their knee up straight and then turn it to one side, that could very well push cold blood back to his heart. So you might be wanting to sort of gently log roll him and tip him over on his side, but it's going to be tricky. And yes, he needs a close watch because he's really at risk now of cardiac arrest.
The Bruce Forsyth bit with the arm and the knee, that's just for stability though, isn't it, really? So if he's, monitored and supported in the snow wall, you can just leave him in his sausage, just roll him over.
Yes, you could roll him over and prop him up with rucksacks or something or other.
It's the head back, isn't it, to keep the tongue out of the way, that's the main thing.
In the recovery, get him into the recovery position and protect his airway. But if we're in the snow hole, there might be a possibility of attempting rewarming. Now, this really isn't rewarming. You're probably going to be unable to effectively rewarm somebody from advanced hypothermia in the field. But trying to add warmth to the hypothermia package may delay any further deterioration. So maybe we could get somebody in the package with him, buddy heat. If we have a stove, maybe we can brew some water and put a hot Nalgene in with him, being very careful protecting the skin because his cold hypothermic skin is quite fragile. He won't be sensate enough to know that it's burning. So protected heat sources should be carefully applied. We could warm the snow hole with the stove, being very careful of CO poisoning.
Declan, I understand you're saying do this at stage 3. Is there any particular reason why you wouldn't do it at stage 2? Because you're already in the shit, aren't you?
Maybe in retrospect we should have right back at stage 2, but I mean it's taken us a while to when he was in stage 2, it's taken us a while to dig a snow hole and get him in here. All of these things have taken time. Maybe we should have done this at stage 2. Sorry, at stage 1, before we went over the Col de Mont Brûlé. Maybe it would have been better to have gone to the Bo-Katan early. But here we are. So just to carry on with the scenario, but you know which way it's going. It's been a long night. You're barely awake. John has stopped breathing. What do you do?
Same as you do with anybody who's stopped breathing.
Yes, that's the right answer. But I'm interested what any mountain rescue team member would say.
Does he say he's not dead till he's warm and he's dead?
That's right. Well, this is really tricky. Yeah, so he's stage 4, not shivering, not conscious, not breathing.
If you had thought that one way or another your communications had got through, either by a passing guided party or you're in reach or whatever else, that if it was somebody with no pre-existing conditions, then my recollection of the mountain rescue guidance is that if you've got the manpower, you would do CPR for 1 hour, because if they had impairments, you might only do it for 20 minutes. But if they were young, healthy, and simply cold, and you had some prospect of rescue, would be okay with that?
Yes, I think that's a good point, Alan. A hypothermic cardiac arrest is different from a cardiac arrest due to heart disease. If you were able to resuscitate well and get them to hospital, they could have a very good prognosis. Like they could walk out 3 days later, for example. But and so the guidance would be you would start basic life support, start CPR until you're rescued. But you will rapidly exhaust. Even with 6 people, you know, taking turnabout every 2 minutes, you will get exhausted. So this is a really difficult situation. But the guidance would be you should attempt cardiac arrest. If you're happy that there is no signs of life, you should spend at least 1 minute assessing for signs of life, for breath, for movement. They may only have three breaths a minute, but if there's any signs of life, leave them be. Don't trigger CPR if there's any basic signs of life. We're rapidly getting into, you know, organized, or, you know, helicopters and intensive care here. But if there was a chance of rescue, you would do basic life support. A hypothermic victim in cardiac arrest should be transported to a hospital that offers ECLS, extracorporeal life support. That's either cardiac bypass or an ECMO machine, where the blood is oxygenated and rewarmed progressively and filtered. And I think, as somebody said, the mnemonic still holds: a hypothermic victim is not dead until rewarmed and dead.
In so many cases, you see people fished out of the ocean, you know, that die 3, 4, 5 days later.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not such an effective rescue solution, is it? I mean, I suppose I'm just asking for your experience, because I have no experience at that level of trying to bring somebody around from this depth of hypothermia. But I mean, presumably it's not that successful trying to rewarm them. Because you see so many people just seem to be, you know, a couple of kids in the ocean for an hour or so, which is obviously quite a serious shock. And then 2, 3 days later, you know, they're not with us anymore.
Well, just to say that sudden immersion hypothermia is different from exhaustion hypothermia. And so if you were a sudden immersion in very cold water, it's different from exhaustion. With gradual progressive hypothermia, there's more a metabolic cool box protective effect.
Oh, right. Okay.
But even still, for immersion hypothermia, yes, you would aggressively attempt CPR and rewarm, and they're still not dead until rewarmed and dead. But actually, in this scenario, that last little bit was just a nightmare. When you wake up in the morning, John is fully recovered and is eating his breakfast, and you're all set to head into Zermatt for your beers. This is just a rough algorithm of all of that I drew up. But in terms of first aid, there's the only other useful resource that I found. The Canadians have this cold card, which can just be printed out and laminated. It uses a slightly different system of staging, and some of their interventions are not quite first aid. You know, for example, giving intravenous fluid for moderate hypothermia. So I'm not quite sure that I buy everything on that page, but on the reverse side, it does have a useful hypothermia package, the hypothermia wrap, which is useful.
Declan, if I can ask, so you've managed to get down, you sat having a beer. So when you look back on it, what should you have done when?
Well, I think when I saw that guided party go down the hill, and we were looking as to go up, that kind of should have prompted something. And certainly when we were below the Bukatan in hypothermia stage 1, and you know, we were still 6 hours out, that should have been the turnaround point for me.
There's a temptation to have a little look, isn't there, each day? You sort of make your plan A, B, and C. Go and have a little look, but really that you want to come back and go hide, don't you? Hide and not continue with such a bad day, really, under such conditions.
But actually, there was something else, you know, in the kind of retrospect thing. I was just thinking about the stuff that Rick Marchant talked about in the Sea Leaders course about setting your gates and being clear about when you need to be by certain places, and if you haven't got there by then, it's time to you know, turn around and execute plan plan B, and just being really clear about what those are at the start of the day and sticking to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, group management, we should not have walked into this, as it were. We, hypothermia from injury perhaps, but we shouldn't have pressed on here. Yeah.
So at the bottom of the call, we're at stage 1, and you're saying go up to the hut. For mine, and the hut just leaves you stuck in the hut. Although it's more protected, you're stuck in the hut. For the amount of effort you would have to expend to get up to the hut, because it's uphill.
Yeah, no,
you get a long way down the valley.
We could have we could have discussed that, I'm sure, depending on how the party was, depending on how the victim was, whether you could just about manage the half an hour it would take to get to the hut, or the 2 hours it would take you to get down to Arulla. Certainly we should have considered both of those options.
And chosen the Arulla option, in my view.
Maybe, yeah, for sure. If he was up for it and was able to ski.
These are those team discussions that wanted doing earlier in the day, aren't they, really?
Yeah.
As much as you can do. I mean, there has to be an element of decisiveness.
So we've a lot of focus on the victim. What about the rest of the party who've also had a hard day at the end of a hard week, out in the cold? They dug a snow hole. They got damp and wet, and they're watching one of their companions having a really crap time.
Yeah.
So I guess my concern about all of this is that you focus on the victim, and if you don't focus on everybody else, if you're not careful, you suddenly end up having another 1 or 2 victims, and out of a team of 6, that really is a bad place to be.
Yeah, no, I mean, leaving aside the post-traumatic stress, but absolutely, maintaining morale, trying to keep the team, cohesive, trying to keep everybody warm, because, as Neil said, if one member is hypothermic, the rest of you are not far away. It's also quite possible that the rest of the party could have been not thinking clearly, underperforming. When you get cold, I mean, we all know it. When you get cold, it's such an effort to do the zips and to find stuff, and your hands don't work. But you're absolutely right, John. We should be looking after the group very attentively.
How much more prone do you think to hypothermia are, for example, a 55, 60 kilogram woman than, say, a 110 kilogram chap? I mean, I know that's difficult to quantify again, but are they radically more vulnerable?
It all depends for those weights on your subcutaneous fat, I think. Really, it depends on your subcutaneous fat.
So you want short and fat women?
Your insulation, yeah. I think actually at the extremes of age, the elderly are more prone, and young children have a larger surface area in their head. They lose heat more through their head, and they're more prone. I have a friend who's a coach. He's a swim coach, and his specialist areas is cross-channel swims. So he frequently gets called in to corporate events to do a group cross-channel swim, and he's got a selection of lean, fit triathletes and fat, podgy, overweight, and he always picks the overweight people because you can train, but you can't compensate for body fat. So 3 centimeters of blubber makes the biggest difference for a cross-channel swim.
I think what you could have done that morning, Declan, possibly is at a review, say after an hour, you could maybe set out and just say how people are feeling.
Yeah.
Rather than leave it so long, because I'm taking Neil's point, you're probably keen to maybe complete the tour, maybe not out of the question to try.
Yeah. No, absolutely. As Joanne said, maybe at the first call, we should have stopped. We should have said, how's it going? Are we up for this? What's the weather looking like? Definitely.
I think maybe before that, because I was out with a mate and we were doing a tour, and within 15 minutes you can change quite quickly, can't you?
Yeah.
And I got to the point where I wasn't making a rational decision, and he was insisting we stopped every 15, and eventually he made the decision to turn around. And I would buy that said past it really. So
yeah,
quite frequent reviews are quite useful.
It was a particularly big day, wasn't it, where you were going to have long periods where you had to climb out, and also you weren't going to have any reception. It's never occurred to me on those sorts of days to try and work out where you might be able to get a mobile phone signal. But that's perhaps something we should be thinking about if we haven't got an inReach.
yes. I don't know of any way that you can, you know, plan that and assess for mobile reception. But I mean, the Hot Guardian. Well, you're an unguardianed trip, so you wouldn't have been able to take advice.
I think each party should have an inReach, really.
I was just going to make a point about the inReach. Is there not a slight concern if you have things like inReach that you end up falling a bit into heuristic traps, i.e. you think you've got the mechanism to get out of anything, and therefore you would probably go a bit further, a bit like a mobile phone to some extent, that you go a bit further into danger than you really should because you've got something that you think is going to get you out of it?
Well, I thought in those wind speeds, the sobering fact would be you'd probably realise the helicopter couldn't have come anyway. I guess that might have focused the mind, but yeah.
I mean, heuristic traps are interesting, and I think, you know, we all don't fall into a heuristic trap just because we have a seatbelt or an airbag in the car. It's a factor, but I think. Yeah, I'm not sure it applies equally across all ages and across all personalities.
I've had an inReach for quite a while, and I've had a Spot before that, and it's a very useful thing to have if you're on your own.
Yeah.
Which I certainly during COVID I've been on my own a lot, and I'm usually on my own about a third of the time anyway. I would say I definitely haven't done anything rash because I've got it, and it doesn't weigh a lot. I've got a battery backup for longer trips, which might be one of them lying about here somewhere. But yeah, I think it's an excellent wee gizmo.
I mean, we're talking about a gradual onset of a problem, hypothermia, but obviously it could be a broken leg or something much worse, couldn't it? So, you know, in an area like that, the need to contact somebody is quite paramount, isn't it, in a real crisis?